Good morning. I'm Bill Schulz, Senior Fellow in Human Rights Policy here at the Center for American Progress. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this program, Human Rights at Home, a domestic policy blueprint for the next administration. This program is co-sponsored by the American Constitution Society, Opportunity Agenda, and the Center. It's commonplace to observe that the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862 represented a milestone in the evolution of American society. But what is far less frequently remarked is that without it, the North might very likely have lost the Civil War. Until 1862, both Great Britain and France were far more kindly disposed to the Confederacy than to the federal government. This is ironic, of course, inasmuch as France had abolished slavery in 1794 and Britain in 1833. But both countries were dependent upon the trade in cotton with the South. And the Confederate government had done a skillful job of wooing Europe's two greatest powers into seriously considering offering military assistance against the North. But with the proclamation of emancipation, any possibility of a European alliance with slaveholders became unthinkable, because now the war was not just about an internal domestic squabble pitting one section of the United States against another. Now it was about a fundamental moral issue that had long been resolved in Europe, and no European government that had to pay the least attention to the sentiment of its own people could take sides against an American government that was trying to destroy slavery. The only practical course then for Britain and France was to stay neutral, a decision that doomed the South to military defeat. That is perhaps the most dramatic example of how U.S. domestic practices have influenced America's relations with the rest of the world, but it's far from the only one. President Truman famously said, "The greatest friend the Kremlin has is Senator McCarthy." In 1957, as the world watched a white mob prevent African-American parents from enrolling their children in Little Rock High School, President Eisenhower went on television to explain his decision to send troops to Little Rock. He said, "Our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation. We are portrayed as a violator of those standards of conduct which the peoples of the world united to proclaim in the Charter of the United Nations. Enforcing the law," he said, "will restore the image of America and all its parts as one nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all." And more recently, the former U.S. ambassador to France, Felix Roten, wrote in the New York Times in 2006, "No single issue is viewed in Europe with as much hostility as our support for the death penalty. When we require European support on security issues, our job is made more difficult." The Chinese have a field day every year reciting statistics on income disparity in the U.S., racial discrimination, and the number of people in prison here in response to our State Department's criticisms of China's human rights record. So we all know, or we certainly ought to, particularly in light of the violations committed during the so-called War on Terror and their implications for America's reputation around the world, we all know that our failures here at home, be they failure to educate our citizenry adequately to compete in a global marketplace, or failure to provide adequate jobs to sustain our economy or adequate health care to sustain our people, have profound implications for America's role in the world. And today, unlike in the days of the Emancipation Proclamation, there exist in international law measurable standards against which to judge our performance, and global experience upon which to draw to inform our policies. But we also know that many Americans express resistance to the concept of human rights, especially as it applies to social and economic welfare, and the devising smart strategies for framing the conversation about rights in ways that will attract the widest possible support, making it clear, for example, that fulfilling rights is not just a nice idea, but a practical benefit to society. This is one of the greatest challenges facing human rights advocates today. So all of this then is what we propose to discuss this morning, this afternoon, starting with Professor Catherine Powell of Fordham Law School, who will describe the blueprint she has authored. She'll be preceded by Judy Applebaum, who will say a word about our co-host, the American Constitution Society. Then we'll hear from Alan Jenkins, Executive Director of the Opportunity Agenda, who will share with us new data on the attitudes toward human rights of America's state-level policymakers, specifically in Illinois and California. And then Dean Harold Hongju Ko of Yale Law School, former Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and perhaps our country's most respected human rights scholar, will offer his perspective on these issues. Following these presentations, we'll take a few minutes for the panel to be in conversation with each other and then throw the floor open to you. Thank you again for coming, Judy Applebaum.
Bill, thank you so much for that great introduction to today's topic. As you heard, I'm Judy Applebaum, the Director of Programs at the American Constitution Society. I want to join CAP and the Opportunity Agenda in welcoming you all here on behalf of the American Constitution Society and thank our wonderful group of panelists for being here today. ACS is thrilled to be releasing this blueprint that you all should have for the new administration on human rights at home. It's authored by Professor Powell in consultation with a very distinguished bipartisan group of advisors, including the other panelists who are here today. ACS, as I hope you know, is a rapidly growing network of lawyers, law students, legal scholars, and others working to advance a progressive vision of the Constitution, law, and public policy. Our mission is to promote the vitality of the Constitution and the fundamental values it expresses: individual rights and liberties, genuine equality, access to justice, democracy, and the rule of law. With new leadership in Washington just around the corner, a major focus of our work right now is the presentation and dissemination of ideas and recommendations for the next administration on legal and policy issues at the core of our mission. So, for example, we've released over 24 papers by ACS members and supporters offering proposals on topics such as the role of the Department of Justice in civil rights enforcement, criminal justice, and legal advice to the President, liberty, security, and the rule of law in the post-9/11 era, government transparency, and the regulatory process. All of these papers are collected on our website, www.acslaw.org/law-and-justice, a page entitled, appropriately enough, A Fresh Start for a New Administration. We are very pleased to now include Professor Powell's blueprint as the latest addition to this collection. The blueprint is aimed at addressing what Professor Powell calls the gap between U.S. human rights principles and practice by proposing mechanisms for integrating human rights principles into U.S. domestic policymaking. For anyone who believes we should strive to uphold human rights, and we're going to be hearing some data suggesting that's just about everyone, these ideas are worth serious consideration. We hope the next administration sees it that way, whoever ends up at the helm. And in the meantime, I know we're in for a fascinating discussion of this topic today, so let's proceed to that. Professor Powell.
Well, I want to thank the co-sponsors, and I want to thank all of you for coming out today. In a matter of days, we'll be electing the next President of the United States. Several Americans say this is the most important election in a generation. One thing's for sure: the next president will have a tremendous opportunity to restore U.S. leadership in human rights at home and around the world. Reaffirming human rights at home is critical, both because human rights are at the core of our founding principle expressed in the American Declaration of Independence, that all of us have basic and inalienable rights, simply by virtue of our humanity. Second, when the U.S. fails to practice what it preaches, it undermines its credibility and its ability to exercise leadership around the world on all of the pressing issues we face, such as the economic downturn. Presidents of both parties have understood this, which is why this blueprint on human rights at home, which is available outside the room for you to pick up, opens with quotes from Ronald Reagan and John F. Kennedy. It's important to drive home the bipartisan commitment to human rights that had developed over several decades, which has emerged from an understanding that ensuring human rights at home and around the world is important not only because it affirms America's deeply held values, but it's also in our national interests. Yes, we face several challenges today: Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, Hurricane Katrina recovery, lack of access to health care, and because of foreclosures, lack of access to affordable housing and basic needs. Persistent inequalities in access to quality education and jobs, racial disparities in the death penalty, racial and ethnic profiling of those who appear Arab, Muslim, or South Asian or immigrant, as well as African Americans and Latinos. The persistent pay gap between female and male workers. These are all human rights issues, and the list goes on. But with the impending election, there are also exciting possibilities for new forms of governance. Look, I'm basically a recovering lawyer, as are many of us in the human rights profession, and I suspect some of you in the room. And yet, rather than sense complacency, I sense an electricity in the air. One way or another, we will see change in January. The question is, what will that change look like, and how can we institutionalize positive change into the structure of government? To capitalize on this moment of transition, the blueprint suggests several ways for the new administration to take concrete steps to mainstream human rights into domestic policymaking and to build human rights principles into the process of U.S. policymaking. In other words, the blueprint seeks to identify mechanisms by which human rights principles can be integrated into all existing areas of U.S. domestic policy where they are relevant. The blueprint contains several recommendations, primarily by suggesting that within the first 100 days, the new president ensure human rights principles are mainstreamed into U.S. policymaking by appointing individuals with a demonstrated commitment to key positions in the Departments of Justice, State, Homeland Security, as well as the National Security Council and elsewhere. The president should support two forms of domestic human rights institutions: a human rights implementation body and a human rights monitoring body. To establish the human rights implementation body, the blueprint recommends that the president issue an executive order within the first 100 days to reconstitute and revitalize the Interagency Working Group on Human Rights to more effectively coordinate among federal agencies and departments responsible for implementing the U.S.'s international human rights obligations. This should be accomplished within the first 100 days to ensure that coordination and implementation of human rights are built into the baseline from the beginning. To underscore this commitment, the president should speak out forcefully in the State of the Union, the inaugural address, or another separate speech dedicated to this topic. And he should back up his words with concrete actions, such as issuing the executive order to reconstitute the Interagency Working Group. To establish a human rights monitoring body, the new administration should support legislation, and there's some pending currently in Congress, to create an independent monitoring body, such as a U.S. Human Rights Commission. This could occur by transforming the existing U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and updating it and strengthening it to a U.S. Commission on Civil and Human Rights. Regardless of whether it's a new body or transforming an existing body, the key is that the new U.S. Human Rights Commission should serve as an independent entity that can be a nonpartisan broker while also supporting government officials in human rights training, in technical assistance, nonpartisan research, and fact-finding. The blueprint also calls on ratification and implementing legislation for many important treaties the U.S. has yet to ratify, though in some cases has signed, as well as legislation to implement existing treaties. Is all of this possible? Well, the dilemma is that on the one hand, the U.S. was founded on the human rights idea and paved the way following World War II for the creation of international institutions and treaties that protect human rights. And polling data, which Alan Jenkins will talk more about, suggests that Americans overwhelmingly support the idea of human rights. But on the other hand, we have an international and domestic divide in U.S. policymaking, and human rights tends to fall on the international side of the ledger, within U.S. foreign policy, in the National Security Council, the State Department, rather than the Justice Department, like the Civil Rights Division or other domestic agencies. Plus, in the presidential campaign, to the extent that the candidates have addressed human rights, it's been primarily focused on the rights of other people overseas or the rights of detainees in holding centers like Guantanamo, where U.S. government conduct is concerned. It would be short-sighted for a new president to focus exclusively on human rights for those people over there in some other country overseas, or when talking about the U.S., focusing primarily on non-citizens. Why? We need only look at the backlash in the United Kingdom to understand that associating human rights exclusively with something foreign is a dangerous strategy that ultimately undermines support for human rights and undercuts the bedrock principle of what America stands for, that rights are inherent in all of us as human beings. That's why we fought the War of Independence, to be free of King George. What could be more patriotic than returning to those roots? How better to perfect our union? Let me close by acknowledging the advisory group for the blueprint. Many of them are in this room. And as important as the recommendations are the process through which we went through in developing the blueprint. The advisors are a bipartisan group of nearly 50 people. And the list includes 3 former Assistant Secretaries of State for Human Rights, including Harold Koh, and Colin Powell's Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Lauren Craner, as well as John Shattuck. A former Commissioner for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, Dean Chris Edley from Berkeley. A former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs from the Bush years, Matthew Waxman. A number of key advocates from across the spectrum and a handful of leading scholars, as well as everyone on this panel, as Judy mentioned. While we didn't agree on everything, there was broad consensus around the recommendations I've mentioned. It's clear that while some on the advisory group will end up in government and a new administration, equally important, others among these advisors will form the constituency that will support government in ensuring human rights at home. This process of consultation with and outreach to a broad group of advisors through this process, we realized it's critical that human rights be viewed as both Republican and Democrat, as both national and grassroots, as both domestic and foreign policy, so that we can develop a broad and deep consensus around human rights. No matter who's elected, we're going to need to develop partnerships between government and civil society to close our gap between human rights principles and practice. Because without government leadership and concerned citizen action in upholding human rights at home, we will look in vain for progress in the world at large. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Catherine. I'm Alan Jenkins. I'm Executive Director of the Opportunity Agenda. I want to thank the American Constitution Society and the Center for American Progress and Catherine for the opportunity to be part of this presentation. The Opportunity Agenda actually launched, our DC launch was in this room 4 years ago. It was not a standing room only event the way today's event is. So, where were you people in the back 4 years ago? We forgive you, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I'm going to share with you a body of research that the Opportunity Agenda has conducted with the support of many people in this room to really understand where different target audiences of Americans are when it comes to human rights here in the United States. And those target audiences include members of the general public, they include policymakers and others. And so I'm going to go through very quickly, but you've both got the full report, and I'm happy to have more specific conversation about particular data points in the question and answer. So I apologize in advance for kind of flying through some of this data, but there's quite a bit of it to discuss. This is just a description of what we did, part of our process, and the highlighted in green are the ones that I'm going to discuss with you today, but it included a wide range of conversations with a lot of different target audiences. I'm going to start by giving you a sense of where we started, which was open-ended conversations with members of the public. And one of the things we did was to literally send out an intern with a digital video camera to talk to Americans about how they thought about human rights. So I'm going to run this quickly, and then we'll talk about the data. Whoop, that didn't work the way it was supposed to. There we go.
Human rights means freedom, liberty, and justice for all.
Human rights to me the right to live, know what I'm saying, in peace and tranquility. Know what I'm saying? That's basically it. Even though we don't be living in peace and tranquility where I'm from, you know what I'm saying?
Human rights. Human rights mean for me. I'm gonna have to skip that one. Human rights is how the government works to, or should work, to give opportunity to other people, its citizens, etc.
Human rights is to treat everyone the same way you would want to be treated. And my mother and father brought me up that way, and I have done that all my life.
It should be like inalienable rights that you are entitled to as a human, but I really don't think that most humans on this planet actually have the human rights that they're entitled to.
Freedom of speech, freedom of self, like it's just everything. Like you got the right to be you.
That's our theme song. You can find it on iTunes. Some of you recognize it from being put on hold. The point here is that Americans own human rights. Human rights is not a foreign concept to Americans, nor to policymakers and others, but they hold it at the level of ideals and values. So very few Americans, 8% of Americans in research a decade ago, were able to identify the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to name it. But everyone who we talked to understood the idea that we all have rights simply by virtue of our humanity, and they believe that that's important to us here on our shores. So I want to give you a sense of what we learned in the national poll that we did and in focus groups. The focus groups were in a cluster of cities around the country, and they were of kind of ordinary folks that for various demographic reasons we believe would be open to a human rights conversation. The poll, however, was of a random sample of the entire U.S. public. So it included people across the geographic spectrum, the class, different racial groups, and ideology. We oversampled Asian Americans, who typically are not sampled in enough numbers to draw conclusions. We offered the telephone poll in Spanish to those who wanted to avail themselves of it. So the first thing we learned is that human rights as a concept is clear and positive for Americans, and it's American. So we didn't hear that it was foreign. We didn't hear that it doesn't belong to us here in the U.S. And that the public readily places a range of social justice issues in a human rights context. And that includes economic and social rights like the right to health care, the right to education, the right to adequate housing. Now, Americans think about economic rights in a slightly different way, which I'll get to, but there was no overt dichotomy or distinction that people expressed to us about those rights as connected to civil and political rights. There is support but little urgency for the notion of human rights. And what that means is when asked to rank human rights along with lots of other issues, the economy and the like, and this poll was taken about a year ago, human rights did not rank near the top of the list, nor did a majority of Americans believe that it was something that we should pursue aggressively vis-a-vis the other priorities of the nation. Why do Americans value human rights? There was a cluster of explanations that rose to the top. Affording people dignity, fairness, and opportunity at the very top. In other words, a values argument, a moral statement about why human rights matter. Contributing to a better society for all. So in other words, not the human rights of women or people of color or immigrants or detainees, but the human rights of everyone for everyone. And pride in America's heritage and founding principles. In the introduction that you heard from Bill, and particularly people of color were the most likely to choose the explanation when offered a range of explanations because of Thomas Jefferson's ideal that we all have rights that no government can take away. And this was frankly surprising to me. I hadn't listed Thomas Jefferson as one of the top reasons for people of color, although I often say he literally did love black people. But in fact, there's a level of social justice patriotism that we need to get in touch with in order to promote this idea with a variety of audiences. We learned, and this won't surprise those of you who are students of public opinion in other contexts, perceptions of government, personal responsibility complicate our communications, and that's particularly so on economic rights. And finally, communicating about international treaties is a challenge, and I'll explain why that's the case, but it probably won't surprise any of you. So quickly, there was broad consensus that all people have basic rights that no one should take away. And in fact, a significant plurality of Americans believe that strongly. And so that was not something that had to be argued about. You wouldn't want to meet that 18% of people who don't believe that on the street. But in fact, the vast majority of the public does agree with that proposition. But what you see is that when we ask people, pardon me, in addition to that, when we ask people whether they agreed or disagreed that we should strive to uphold human rights in the U.S., because there are people being denied their human rights in our country, you get significant agreement, and in fact, significant strong agreement. That was positive and somewhat of a surprise. So in other words, there is, and that's a compound question, right? It's important to uphold human rights, and there are people being denied their human rights in the United States, and we got agreement, significant agreement with that proposition. However, as I noted, when asked if we should proceed aggressively, cautiously, slowly, or simply allow human rights to evolve naturally, the largest group, almost a majority, said that we should proceed cautiously. And that's important to those of us who view human rights as front and center. What were the rights that Americans agreed are human rights? And all of these numbers are strongly held. So in other words, the numbers that you see, 86% of Americans believed strongly that equal opportunities regardless of gender is a human right, regardless of race, high percentages, being treated fairly in the criminal justice system, freedom from discrimination, freedom from torture, equal access to quality public education. Those are all what we would consider first-tier human rights. Large majorities believe strongly, and then significant additional numbers of people believe somewhat that these are human rights. The second tier, access to health care, 72% believe strongly, a clean environment, fair pay for workers to meet their basic needs for food and housing, keeping personal behavior and choices private, which is, of course, a shorthand for a wide range of privacy rights. Now, those are second tier, but you still see that there's significant levels of public support. So in the second presidential debate, when Tom Brokaw asked, is health care a right, a privilege, or a responsibility, you see that the vast majority of Americans believe it's a right. Now, there are nuances to that, and it goes back in many ways to concerns about government and personal responsibility, but there's broad consensus on that. 89% total believe that health care is a human right. And here's the third tier, equal opportunity regardless of being gay or lesbian, 57%. And this is consistent with broad trends. Typically, the right to marry is not part of that, and there's a drop-off. But there's a trend towards the belief in human rights for irrespective of sexual orientation. Freedom from poverty, adequate housing, ensure economic opportunity. And then you see 40% abortion, but that's 40% strongly. So there's actually a majority who believe that, at least somewhat, that it's a human right. These were examples of human rights violations that we asked. These are all poll numbers that we asked whether people agreed or disagreed. So you see that police stopping people based solely on race, lack of quality education for children in poor communities, U.S. torturing prisoners. That question was actually, is it a human rights violation when the United States is torturing terrorism suspects? And you see a significant number said yes. Treatment of residents after Katrina. Now, we learned from the focus groups that what people meant was like a second after Katrina, right? So when you were actually on top of your roof or in the Superdome being denied basic food, shelter, and the like, was a human rights violation. After that, people weren't so sure. Now, they didn't think it was a good thing. They thought it was a bad thing that happened, but they weren't sure whether it was a human rights violation. And, quote, illegal immigrants, and that's what the poll question used because that's what's in the public discourse, denied medical care. And you see there's a drop-off to only half. And here you begin to see the nuances of people's thinking about human rights. Because you'll remember that 72% believe strongly that health care is a human right. 89% believe at least somewhat. But only 49% believe that denying undocumented immigrants medical care is a human rights violation. So if you were to look at this logically, you'd ask, well, what part of human rights don't you understand? But in fact, this is not a logical exercise, right? People are giving their responses often from the gut, often the first time they've thought about it, and you begin to see the complexity of how Americans think about human rights. So what are the challenges? There's concern about the role of government. We're going to talk about that. There's concern about personal responsibility, I've said before. Mixed beliefs on U.S. exceptionalism, about the idea that the United States is somehow set apart when it comes to human rights, and resistance to the notion of international enforcement. So let's dive right in. The role of government. Americans are more comfortable with government as protector of human rights than provider, although a majority said that they think that government should also be a provider. They're much more ambivalent about that. And what comes up again and again in the focus groups is, well, what about personal responsibility? If we give people everything, and by everything people are often talking about economic rights, then shouldn't we be worried that people will get complacent, that it'll erode their responsibility to go out and get those things? You'll see that there is general support for the idea that in order to protect and provide the full range of human rights, we have to expand government. And so between those who believe strongly and those who believe somewhat that that is true, you have a meaningful majority. But what you also see is agreement with the notion that, quote, poor people have become too dependent on government programs. And I think if this data is from a year ago. It would be interesting to see where people's heads are at on this today. But this is a fairly persistent finding. So if it's different today, it's probably a blip rather than a meaningful change, although that's in part up to us. The notion of U.S. exceptionalism in the sense that the U.S. doesn't need human rights because we have a Constitution and Bill of Rights. That was generally rejected, strongly rejected by the public. I would note from the focus groups that Americans also have a very distorted and overly positive view of what rights are in the Constitution. So we had a kind of, show of hands, right to housing, sure, right to health care, definitely, Bill of Rights says that. And so you begin to see some of this cynicism about government, right? If you believe that there's a right to health care in the Constitution, and yet 47 million Americans don't have health insurance, then what does that say about the force of our Constitution and laws? Here you begin to see some of the erosion. When you ask people, do they agree or disagree that the U.S. shouldn't sign treaties, international treaties, because it could violate our sovereignty, you see very close call, agree versus disagree. And this broad agreement that the United Nations is not an effective enforcer of human rights. And that cuts across ideology, that particular finding. When we asked whether people in the United States should not try to interpret or enforce human rights for people in other countries, you get significant agreement. And part of that, I believe, is an anti-colonialist sentiment. People of color were especially likely to answer that they agreed. But it also, of course, cuts against the notion of universal human rights that apply everywhere. And the second question, because of different cultures, is it impossible to apply uniformly human rights? And you see that there's meaningful majority agreement. In the materials that we've given you in this larger report, there's a tab of cluster analysis. That's in some ways one of the most important in terms of actualizing this research in our advocacy, in our lawmaking, in our communications. That's actually one of the most important pieces because it breaks down the American public into sectors, not so much demographically as based on ideology, how they've answered these various questions. And what you see is that the news is overwhelmingly good. Human rights champions, which as the name suggests, are people who are reliably with us on the notion, the ideal, and the applications of human rights. They're not aware of the international treaties and the like, but they are supportive of the idea of human rights. 29% of the public. The younger folks who are more cautious, more likely to say we should move cautiously, 19%. And then another group which is suspicious about the notion of international enforcement, but very much supportive of enforcing human rights at home, 21%. So what you get is 69% open and persuadable towards our point of view. We were in a focus group of women in Chicago who fell into that champions group, and the facilitator from Belden, Rusinello, and Stewart said, well, what about personal responsibility? Shouldn't we be worried about that? And they thought about it a minute and said, nah, Now, this is the only focus group I've ever been in which they affirmatively rejected the notion of personal responsibility. And yet, that was what we saw with the champions in the context of human rights. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to really kind of jump through this, but happy to talk with you about the details of the implications of this particular set of research. But if I leave you with nothing else, lead with values is very important. When we start, we were at a training recently, and somebody said, well, how do I talk about ICERD, meaning the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination? And the first thing we said was, don't ever use the word ICERD again when you're trying to convince people who are not currently with you. And so the notion of leading with values and not with treaties is crucial. We need to get to the treaties, and part of the research we're doing now is about how to talk about treaties with a range of audiences. The last piece of research I want to share with you was done with policy makers and their staff in the states of Illinois and California, and here are the dates and the circumstances under which it was done. And quickly, here's what we found. Human rights in the U.S. are applicable as far as these folks are concerned, and these were Republicans, Democrats, and independents, conservatives, liberals, and moderates. They see human rights as belonging to our country. They have a slightly greater awareness of treaties and international human rights laws. That's pretty scary, since under our federal system, they're responsible for enforcing international treaties on human rights. There was a mild level of awareness of that. Their reasons for supporting human rights were overlapping but a bit different. They focused very much on basic survival needs like food and shelter, but also on the notion of American ideals and freedoms, especially when it came to kind of civil and political rights. There were challenges and disagreements. There's disagreements about which rights fit and which rights don't fit within the panoply. Personal responsibility came up. But the last item, which some of you may not be able to see, concerns about the ability to protect and deliver many rights. And this is important. A lot of even progressive lawmakers said to our interviewers, well, you know what, I believe health care is a human right, but if I say it's a human right, then I'm a human rights violator because I don't believe I can deliver it, at least not right now, with budget deficits and the like. And that was a very important thing for us all to remember as we push human rights at home, that we need to give lawmakers tools and achievable goals towards fulfilling the full range of human rights. If we simply say, well, you know, it's 47 million uninsured, therefore you're a human rights violator, it sometimes can be a disincentive to people, to lawmakers saying, yes, I believe health care is a human right. It doesn't mean we should back away at all from the core values and goals of our advocacy, but we need to give lawmakers some tools that they can use. This is largely redundant with what the public said, so I'm going to jump through it. These were the kind of the rank order in which lawmakers saw things as being human rights. So one thing you see is that the American public is way ahead of lawmakers, even in California and Illinois, states that at least believe themselves to be way ahead of the rest of the states. Much more concerned about economic security rights, economic and social rights amongst lawmakers in those states than amongst the general public. As I said, limited awareness of international treaties or implications at the state level, and some of them felt that knowing more about international treaties could actually help them to do their work. But the ones who weren't already supporting human rights in the U.S. were unlikely to say that they wanted to learn more, that it was relevant for them. So what are our recommendations here? Understanding the various divisions amongst groups, introducing the human rights frame in manageable parts, and pragmatic, achievable solutions, promoting due process and racial justice as acknowledged human rights. And this is not to say that lawmakers agree that racial discrimination is a human right that's being violated, but they do agree that it's a human right. And the same is true with due process. And so you get no argument from them in talking about that. And we recommend starting there. That's not to say that we don't push for the full range of human rights, but we need to know where we're starting conversations as opposed to closing them off. Linking healthcare with other basic survival needs. This is very important. Insofar as lawmakers thought about healthcare as crucial to people's survival and prosperity, then they were willing to acknowledge that it was a human right. When they thought of it as a luxury, then they weren't. And promoting human rights as serving the common good. the idea that it's better for all of us if human rights are respected. That was the number one most resonant argument with those folks, and as you know, it was one of the most resonant arguments with the general public. And then finally, showing sympathetic lawmakers how a human rights approach and tools can help them. Not simply how we can convince more people to talk about human rights, but how their goals of, for instance, ensuring more and more Americans of protecting due process and against racial discrimination can be advanced by using a human rights narrative, by taking advantage of human rights tools and treaties. So I wanted to end with a piece of legislation that we helped in a small way to advance in the state of Connecticut, recognizing the equal access to the highest attainable standard of health as a human right and a priority of the state of Connecticut, passed by the legislature, signed by a Republican governor, showing, I think, that there is appetite to move forward with human rights if we can be creative and find the ways to advance it that fit with the moment. Last thing I'll say is that I think we find ourselves now in a moment in which many of the things that we thought were impossible are now possible. Americans, other opinion research shows, are willing to embrace a whole new relationship between the people and our government, a whole new social compact. And I think it's going to be very important for us to take advantage of that moment while really ensuring that all of our human rights are protected. So thanks very much.
Well, thanks to everyone here for sponsoring this event and for the two terrific presentations we've just heard. Ted Sorensen, who is John Kennedy's speechwriter, told me that his father was the warden or the head of the Nebraska Department of Corrections, and he was asked to address a very large crowd like this of recidivist offenders, repeat offenders. And he got up and he didn't know what to say. And at first he was going to say, "Ladies and gentlemen," and he realized there were no ladies in the audience. Then he thought to say, as John McCain would, "My friends." Then he realized that he didn't really think of them as friends. And then he said, finally, "It's good to see so many of you back here." Now, this has a special meaning for this group because back here means back thinking about how the government can promote human rights domestically and internationally rather than obstruct them or violate them. And that's a very good place to be in. I completely agree with Alan that things are possible now that have not been possible for almost a decade. And that part of the goal of this agenda, I think, is really going back to the future, returning to an agenda that has been stalemated, cut off, truncated by the war on terror and other issues. And I think the reason that we are here is because this is a group of what Alan called human rights champions, right? We are the champions, my friends. And so the question is how to put these agenda items into play. One way, obviously, is to understand what the people are thinking, which is what Alan's research shows. Another is to set forth a concrete and specific set of issues, which is what the blueprint demonstrates. And one of the great skills you learn in law school is to incorporate by reference, which I do with regard to everything that has gone before. What I wanted to do, though, was to talk about a number, 10 to be specific, isms that we should be worried about at this particular time. Because these isms could, I think, infect or take away the moment of opportunity. And I say this as someone who served in a Republican administration in the 80s in the Justice Department, in the Democratic administration in the 90s in the State Department. I've seen a number of transitions in Washington, a successful one from Carter to Reagan, a chaotic one from Bush to Clinton. And as someone who sued both Democratic and Republican administrations, and in one case later joined the administration that I had sued. Now, let me just go through these isms. Number one is take a break-ism, or the feeling of exhaustion. This is the most ridiculous, long-standing, exhausting campaign in history. And there might be people who say, well, we need a breather now. Take stock-ism. That is not the thing to do right now. This is the time to immediately press forward for strong and decisive action. There are some people who are exhausted, like the Tampa Bay Rays, and lose the series. There are others, like the Boston Red Sox, who surge back and then sweep on to victory. And that's exactly what needs to be done now. The election was a means to an end. The end is reclaiming the human rights agenda, among other things. And so the idea that somehow victory is in hand, now let's all figure out which positions we're going to try to get as assistant secretary to the assistant secretary for balloons, is not the goal. A second ism to be resisted, I think, is go slow-ism, or now is not the time-ism. I'm really surprised by a number of panels I participated on, even with very progressive people, in which the tone is, a lot of these things are a lot more complicated than you think. Closing Guantanamo is really complicated. That'll take a year. Or, actually doing the diplomacy will take really a long time. Or undoing the Bush administration's policy to the International Criminal Court is going to be so complicated. We really should take our time. Don't believe this for a second. Decisive, directive administrations can move forcefully and quickly, drive change, declare principles to be followed by action, send a clear signal, and the idea that things that were done rapidly by people with no political mandate have to be done very slowly by people with a strong political mandate is really ridiculous. Guantanamo can be addressed very quickly by announcing, we will close Guantanamo. It will be done by date X. I have formed certain groups to do that. We will have experts looking at the situation. We will handle the details, but it will be done, and it will be done fast. And we want to get this albatross over. And those of you in Congress, the idea that, well, I don't want these people to be brought to my district, which I heard a lot of recently from Senator Brownback. You're not going to bring them to Kansas, are you? Well, therefore, why don't we leave Guantanamo open forever, even though everyone thinks it's terrible, because we don't want to bring them to Kansas. Now, the fact of the matter is, Timothy McVeigh killed hundreds of people. He was brought to a supermax prison in Colorado. He was held consistently with due process. He did not threaten anyone who was either a fellow inmate or in his community, and a criminal trial and conviction was done. Now, it seems to me that this is a place where high governmental officials and those pushing those high governmental officials should say, Gordian knots are to be cut. They are not to be unraveled, because it takes too long. And the time that you have a Gordian knot and that can be cut is at the beginning, the first 100 days, which is why I very much agree with the agenda put forward by Kathy Powell. We should claim the transition. The transition should be an incredibly important time for moving forward. The Reagan transition used the transition period to release hostages from Iran who had been held for more than a year. They came out on Inauguration Day. That gave the Reagan administration lift. The Clinton administration agonized about what to do about Guantanamo for their Haitians. They took ownership of the policy, and they couldn't change the policy until more than a year and a half after they were in office. This is a really important difference. Rhetorical statements at the beginning are very important. It was Ted Sorensen, who I quoted, who said, let the word go forth from this time and place that we are born, the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century who will pay any price, bear any burden to bring back the change, which is what they voted for. You did not bring about, and both candidates are campaigning on a strong agenda of breaking with the past, and therefore break with the past quickly, because most of what happened in the last 8 years, much of it in this area, should not have been done. Another ism that we need to think about is over-governmentalism. Government is important, but one of the positive features of the last 8 years is the rise and pushback of civil society, the banding together of groups like this one. You now have the possibility of cooperative governmental officials to work with rather than having to litigate against them. Keep civil society strong and alive and active. Another is institutionalism, creating institutions, and that's what I think Kathy Powell's paper is very important for a number of things. Strengthening interagency working groups, recognizing that certain institutions that were created had insufficient mandates. Homeland security, immigration is under Homeland Security, as if the only purpose of immigration is to protect ourselves from immigrants. Now, that was a feature of the time in which it was created. That has to be changed. And that's why in testimony I gave before the Senate Judiciary Committee, some of it is referenced in Kathy's paper, the idea of 1, using the transition, 2, pushing forward quickly with executive orders, 3, introducing and engaging a legislative process, and 4, reactivating a diplomatic process which involves re-engagement with international institutions and replacing diplomatic engagement with for unilateralism ought to be a key. Another ism I think to be avoided is thinking smallism. Special interests or individual groups pressing only on their issue and not seeing the big picture. The fact of the matter is the economy is in the tank. The Iraq war needs to be fixed. We have a very powerful need to address energy. And therefore, we have to recognize that these are overriding pressing values. A president who cannot solve those problems will not have the capacity to do other things. And so it means seeing the big picture. But at the same time, I oppose marginalism, the idea that the human rights issues ought to be at the margins of process, which is about, quote, real interests, as opposed to part of the mainstream of interests. These issues need to be taken to the core of what these policies are. As you saw, we have both campaigns running against an administration on the grounds that they forsook basic values of the United States polity and culture, and that needs to be changed. And you can run on that. If you can run on that, then these should be at the core of our agenda. Why? Because they help to define our national interest. Another isn't to be avoided, I think, is partisanism. There's been a lot of pressing for human rights on both sides of the aisle, particularly with regard to a certain set of issues: religious freedom, trafficking, immigration reform. These ought to be made a central point of what we do. Community building, faith-based activities. All of these, I think, can be incorporated into what should be done. So breaking this down again into partisanism is a very dangerous thing to do at this particular moment. My point is, what you heard from Alan Jenkins' presentation is we must generate urgency. Generate urgency because people care about these issues. They just, according to Alan, and I think he's right, don't think it's urgent enough given other things we do, which are core interests. That's the opposite of what we ought to believe. And here, let me close with this idea. There are some people who want to stay away from a rights discourse because they think it seems old. Even some progressive people think it's old, left. Let's not speak rights speak in favor of something else. I would say the discourse is what got us to this place. The discourse needs to be carried forward. The question is, will the United States be again in the mainstream and leadership of the discourse? And what I would say that all of you should say is human rights is not marginal to who we are. Human rights defines who we are. The United States is a country defined by human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal. It was to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity that we created a Constitution of the United States of America and a structure of government. If human rights have become marginal, it is urgent that we return to the center of what we do and to the center of our national interest and national life, because otherwise we have lost our national identity at the beginning of the 21st century. And that is not just good, it is smart. Why? Because as you heard from Bill Schultz, human rights is a magnetic idea to foreigners. Those of us who are new Americans came to this country in search of these rights, which were not available elsewhere. And more than that, increasingly on a bipartisan basis, starting with the Carter administration, but carrying forward through Reagan, Bush, Bush 1, Bush 2, Clinton, human rights has been connected as a core national interest. and therefore ought to be incorporated in it. What I'm saying is, it is not that human rights are as American as apple pie. Apple pie was founded, as far as I know, in Bavaria. Apple pie would be as lucky to be as American as human rights. And for us, the job is to make sure that go slowism, now is not the timeism, incrementalism, counting on governmentism, don't take over the shop. Finally, with regard to economic rights, obviously, in a time where there's little or no governmental money, we worry about those issues of economic rights. But people understand something very profound these days. There's a right not to lose your house. There's a right not to lose your bank account. There's a right not to lose your life savings. There's a right not to be abandoned by your government in a natural disaster. These are economic, social, and cultural rights. And if anything has been rebutted in the last few years, it's that the government is always the problem and not the solution. But the government can't go it alone. It needs some help from their friends. And those friends include the champions. And as I said, we are the champions, my friends. And I think we've got to carry forward on this agenda in the next 4 years and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great. So thanks very much to all three of the panelists for an excellent presentation. I'm going to ask each of them a question. The other panelists are more than welcome to chime in, and then we will throw it open to all of you. I'll go in the order of the presentations, first to Catherine Powell. And I want here to try to bridge some of what Catherine's work in the blueprint has provided us with some of Alan's findings and actually with Harold's very last point on social and economic rights. And I want to do this, Catherine, by asking you a two-part question related to this issue. One of your major recommendations is that the mandate of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission be expanded and that the commission be renamed U.S. Civil and Human Rights Commission and have a much broader mandate and a new appointment process. And what I'm interested in is, given that throughout its history, the Commission's primary work and identity has been focused on traditional civil and political rights, and of course expanding the name to the U.S. Civil and Human Rights Commission might in some way be perceived as privileging civil rights. What I'd like to have you talk about is first what your thinking was behind choosing to expand the commission rather than to create a new entity, a U.S. Human Rights Commission. And then conversely, given the skepticism that Alan has identified about social and economic rights and the fact that the Commission on Human Rights might be limited by statute to considering violations of rights that are recognized either by U.S. treaty obligations or U.S. law, neither of which in general recognize social and economic needs as rights, what authority might this new commission cite, or how would that commission be mandated to address social and economic rights in addition to the traditional civil and political?
Mm-hmm. No, these are great questions. And, you know, the blueprint talks about using the Commission on Civil Rights as a possible starting point for the Human Rights Commission, because one of the things we really like to see is to see human rights mainstream into every institution of government. And we're not so much interested in creating parallel structures that marginalize human rights. We've seen that happen in the women's human rights movement, how when you create an office on women's rights, it oftentimes is the least powerful entity, right? So we're really interested in mainstreaming human rights into existing institutions. Your question about does this then privilege civil rights if it became a commission on civil and human rights is an excellent one. And I think over the decades since the civil rights revolution of the 60s, we've seen the connections between race and poverty are so significant that we need to look beyond a traditional civil rights paradigm to one that really embraces human rights more fully, and that will actually advance the agenda for race equality as well as beyond. I think the reason for thinking about expanding the Civil Rights Commission but not completely erasing that history is because there is a very important history that we wouldn't want to lose. There's an important constituency around civil rights, and I think we can use that history to build from a position of strength to broaden the civil rights agenda to a full-fledged Human Rights Commission. So that's my thinking on that front. In terms of could a commission embrace economic rights, because the U.S. has not yet ratified the Economic Rights Covenant, though the U.S. has signed the Economic Rights Covenant. So there is a kind of baseline commitment there. And I think we have seen, particularly with the issue of health care and the way it's been discussed in the election, and a commitment really from both McCain and Obama to see access to health care for all Americans is important, is really a very important starting point. And just, I heard on NPR this morning interviews with families about the economic crisis. One family talking about how they had, because they had spent so much on health care beyond what they could afford, that they almost lost their home. So looking at the connections, and I think one of you said this, the connections, I think Alan mentioned this, looking at healthcare, the way it connects up with other survival needs. So I think we need to keep talking about this in ways that really resonate with the everyday needs of Americans to build support, whether it's support to ratify the Economic Rights Covenant, which I hope a new administration would do, or even before we ratify, to just begin to build support for the idea of economic rights in our domestic laws.
Thank you. Do either of you want to say anything about that?
Sure. I mean, I'd just say quickly that on the one hand, our research didn't really show skepticism about economic rights as much as ambivalence. So, right to health care, right to education got as significant supermajority support amongst the American public as, due process and many other civil and political rights. But people have these underlying concerns about role of government and the like. And those are concerns that cut across a social agenda. They're not limited by any means to human rights. I do think in terms of policy, if you're going to reform the Civil Rights Commission, which certainly needs reforming, it's going to need to be authorized by statute or treaty, and so those would be the rights that it would be enforcing. But I do think there is the overlap that Catherine mentioned. So just to give you a concrete example, the International Covenant Convention on Against Discrimination Based on Race, the infamous ICERD, it covers economic principles. So again, to drill down, in New York City, the Opportunity Agenda has a map, healthcarethatworks.org, where you can see where hospitals are located in New York vis-a-vis health needs, race, and poverty. And what you immediately see, for instance, is that Southeast Queens, one of the most diverse places on earth with staggering health needs, has no hospitals, despite the infusion of federal funds into hospitals in New York City through the Department of Health, through Medicaid, Medicare, and the like. That's clearly a human rights violation, whether or not it violates the text of any statute. And it's something that it seems to me a reformed Commission on Civil and Human Rights would have the authority to address. And the last thing I would say is that I think we need to have a more sophisticated conversation about economic rights, but that doesn't mean we should hesitate towards enforcing them. But I do think the statutory and treaty authorization needs to come first.
Well, this leads me to the question I wanted to ask you, Alan. And I want to focus on the arguments that you did hear in expressing that ambivalence about social and economic rights, particularly the need for health care and economic security. And I want to quote from a paragraph in your report. You said, some people say in expressing their ambivalence, I won't call X a human right because I can't deliver on it, even though I believe we should all guarantee it. Others say, I don't believe X is so essential as to call it a human right. And some also say, these things are not owed to people just because they're human beings. People have to earn the right. Mm-hmm. Those are the people we don't want to meet in that back alley you mentioned. Exactly. Now, it strikes me, and I'd like your response to this, and I want to give you a chance to talk more about how to frame responses to this, which you didn't entirely have time to address. It strikes me that the replies to these groups, at least from a rational point of view, are fairly straightforward. After all, for the pragmatic worriers, while social and economic rights are every bit as legitimate as civil and political, even their strongest offenders recognize that their achievement may need to be incremental, ameliorative, so that our inability to realize them all at once is not an argument against recognizing them as rights. Mm-hmm. And similarly, the response to the second group, those are the people who argue that health or a job is not essential to human welfare. The response is on some level an empirical one. Try living without health or a job. But it's the response to the third group, those who believe that rights have to be earned, that I think is most interesting, because it requires people on both sides of the argument to sort out the relation between rights and responsibilities. Rights, after all, are not an absolute license for irresponsible behavior. That's why all but the most fundamental of them can be subject to derogation under certain circumstances. It's why we have libel laws. And to guarantee a right to health care, for example, is not to invite people to utilize public health services wantonly, or guarantee a right to economic security. It is not an invitation to sloth. Legislation that sets appropriate limits are certainly legitimate. So what I'm interested in your talking a little bit about, particularly in light of the article in the Times this morning on how Drew Weston has helped progressive politicians reframe their messages and talk about health care as a right, especially to hardworking Americans. Talk a little bit about how these issues might be framed in ways that would respond to these particular concerns.
Sure. Well, a couple things. I mean, one is the comments that you mentioned are from the policymaker interviews, right? So one thing to remember is that typically, not in every part of the country, but typically the public is out ahead of policymakers. And so one response is to go directly to the people, right? So in other words, to rally the champions and to bolster the young, cautious, and U.S. human rights supporters to really speak out and make their voices heard in a way that will really forces the policymakers to follow. I think that's one piece. I think another piece is being pragmatic. I mean, you referenced the notion that economic and social rights in the international sphere are subject to this notion of progressive realization, that they don't always have to be done all at once, although in a country as rich as the United States, I think one could debate how long that progressive realization should take. But I think for the policymakers, insofar as we can give them a path with stepping stones along the way, they're going to be more receptive. I think those that believe that you have to earn human rights are luckily a minority. They're both a minority of the public and a minority of policymakers. And some of them are not going to be convinced by persuasion. They may be convinced by other forces, like you're going to lose your job unless you deliver on a right to health care, but they're unlikely to have a emotional metamorphosis and decide that these things are rights, unless maybe they lose their own health insurance. But I do think that we can both rally the base and as advocates provide very specific stepping stones to get where we need to go, so that the notion of human rights to lawmakers doesn't seem so daunting. It doesn't seem like something that if they don't deliver 100% tomorrow, they're suddenly war criminals. However, that they need to understand that if they don't make significant and steady progress, then they are in fact moving towards violating the rights of their constituents.
Harold, to you, I think the folks in this room would be very sympathetic to your rejection of go-slowism. And you, of course, had a very appealing comment when you said something like, how can an administration with no mandate make major changes and one with a great mandate go slow? We love that line. But the reality is also that the number of people who are voting for whoever wins, based upon those candidates' positions about critical human rights issues, unless we expand the definition of those issues to include issues of economic security and health care. The number of people who are voting based on their position on what to do about Guantanamo Bay or Darfur or anything else is relatively small. In fact, we did here at CAP a survey of the number of questions that the candidates in both parties were asked during the primaries that in the broadest possible terms during the primary debates could be construed as human rights related questions, and it was under 5%. So given that, and the fact that in terms of human rights organizations, there are very few that have large grassroots supporters, at least traditional human rights organizations. If you were advising the new president about some of those initial decisions that you think could help build or create that mandate or build upon that mandate, particularly in light of the fact that people have largely voted on issues like the economy and perhaps the Iraq War, what would be your recommendations about some of those first 2 or 3 key human rights related decisions or executive orders or legislation, introduction of legislation or whatever, that you think could most effectively build up that mandate, build upon the mandate that whoever has and create more of a human rights culture in a new administration?
Well, I buy none of the things you said at the beginning.
Okay, well,
You know, people are voting for change. They're sick of the status quo. They're sick of the status quo, right? And the other thing you heard is, you know, which presidential candidate said, our government will never torture again? That's McCain, right? Now, maybe 5% or 2% of the people care about it. But, you know, in a debate, a Republican candidate had to step out there and distance himself from the status quo. So why go slow on that? Now, how about Guantanamo? How many people, if you polled them, said, oh, Guantanamo is a great idea. Let's stick with Guantanamo forever. You know, nobody favors Guantanamo. So on that, go fast. Go fast. Now, so my view on that is, you know, we are electing a leader, and the leader is going to appoint other people who are supposed to demonstrate leadership. That leadership has one mandate initially, which is, how about this? You have nothing to fear but fear itself. You know, I heard the president give a speech in which he said, and you all saw the Daily Show analogy to the Iraq war announcement, our economy is destroying itself. We are about to go into chaos, past the bailout. Now, is that leadership? You know, I scare you and you act. In other words, you don't oppose it. Well, you know, it showed how many people listened. His own party rebelled and didn't support the bill. Now, there is another way to do this, which happens in time of crisis. You saw it with FDR, which is to say, we are going to have to work our way out of this. Here are the different pieces of it. We do have to have an agenda. It is a different vision. The vision is a bipartisan vision. And here are some elements of it. And where I think there is agreement, you know, Jack Goldsmith, in his own book, writes about this, The Terror Presidency. The collapse of our soft power is hurting us. And one way you build up soft power is actually look like you stand for the values that are distinctly American, like the rule of law, like human rights, etc. Now, on social, economic, and cultural rights, I think we're in an interesting moment of opportunity because of the very force of state and local initiatives. In this, just remember why economic and social and cultural rights got stalled when they did, because the Warren Court was able to go so far. You know, the turning point was the right to education, San Antonio versus Rodriguez, that's 1972. And then suddenly, we weren't speaking in the language of economic and social and cultural rights at the federal level. But at that time, on other areas of rights, the feds were the engine, as were the courts, and the states were the source to be resisted. For the last 20 years, the feds have been the problem, and the states have developed these initiatives. So one of the moments of opportunity, which Alan has really correctly picked up on, is one thing I mentioned, the energizing of civil society, including all of these NGO groups which did not exist, and the motivation of state and local initiatives. You know, the fact that states like Connecticut will include a right to health care, that many states have a right of education, and to say this is a moment where the states and the feds can actually both be on the same page with regard to providing basic economic, social, and cultural rights. And I think the message and the way to sell that message is this the way Americans should live in the 21st century? You know, this is Tom Friedman's line, right? And Tom Friedman, if you read his column, he doesn't style himself as a rights guy, but he does point out things like, isn't it amazing that my children have a worse education now than people in China? Isn't it amazing that health care costs a lot more in America and people get so much less? You know, isn't it amazing that we don't have basic security of our savings, 70, 80 years after the Depression? It is amazing. And don't other countries have certain kinds of solutions that we need to look to, because we are used to Americans being at the lead? Now, isn't it amazing that we have no energy policy when other countries have developed one? And that we are, therefore, captive. Again, here, both, you know, McCain and Obama may disagree about whether drilling is the #1 option, but they don't disagree that being captive to a group of anti-democratic oil producers is not the wave of the future. So my view on this is you have never had such a strong mandate, I think, in my lifetime since John Kennedy for change. And I think they should hear the message of change. And if a lot of members are thrown out of the Congress, the new members should change. We haven't had that kind of tidal wave since the post-Watergate Congress. And those people voted for something different than what they had. So the one thing it clearly suggests is stand-patism is not what people are voting for. They're not voting to come back in 2012 and be in the exact same situation we're in now with Guantanamo still alive, torture continuing, no progress on any of these rights issues. They're just not.
Okay. If I could just add briefly to that. In 1938, at the height of the Great Depression, New York State convened a constitutional convention and amended its constitution to create a right to the public's health, to create an obligation on the legislature to, quote, care for the needy, and increased the state's authority to tax the rich. I think that's the kind of conversation that we're in now, conversation about is it that we cannot afford to protect economic rights because of our financial situation, or that we can't afford not to invest in those protections given the moment that we're in.
Very good. Thank you all. Let's throw it open to you. I think we have a roving microphone here, and please give your name and affiliation if you would. There are some folks in the back there on the left.
Hi, Charlie Brown with undiplomatic.net. This is directed to both Catherine and to Harold. Harold, I would say that another ism that you missed is bureaucratism. One of the challenges I think we face is the tension between not repeating the mistake of having, as you noted earlier today, the vice president's legal counsel issuing orders to the rest of the government, as opposed to having something like what happened in the Clinton administration, where there was an interagency working group on human rights that functionally didn't really work. That was not just a product of the Bush administration. It was one of the people, along with Harold and others, who championed that agency. It wasn't as effective because the Defense Department and others didn't want it to be effective. So I'll just leave it there. But the question is, how do we address this tension where we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the Bush administration, where things were rammed through without consultation, where we had executive orders being issued without the NSC advisor, the Secretary of State, Attorney General even knowing what's going on, and on the other hand, having this creeping clearance process where you have to go through so many people that it ends up slowing down what we're trying to do quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the working group, and you're right to reference the history that it was established under the last 2 years of President Clinton, and they only had 2 years to really get it up and running. It was important because it did get buy-in from people at the Assistant Secretary level, like Harold Koh. But on the other hand, there was a learning curve. It was based in the National Security Council, which was important because it has so much power. But on the other hand, a number of the domestic agencies, like the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, thought, well, what do these human rights treaties have to do with us? We're the Justice Department Civil Rights Division. So there was a learning curve there. In the blueprint, we've attached a proposed new executive order that basically redlines the old executive order, but makes substantial changes to empower the domestic agencies, for example, by setting up working groups that are more focused so that the work can be more focused and so that they can go beyond what the working group was able to do in the Clinton years. And during the Bush years, the working group was effectively disbanded and the work of reporting to treaty bodies was carried on, but there needs to be a more coordinated effort to really reach out to domestic agencies and make sure they feel ownership over the domestic human rights agenda.
Harold, do you want to comment also?
Yeah, well, first of all, we're talking about driving change from the top down, which requires discipline and agreement on a common message and an awareness that issues shouldn't be compartmentalized between agencies, or that the domestic and the international should not be so separate as we thought. Which means really, getting a group of high-level people appointed quickly, having them put people who are like-minded in below them, and get together on a message which is clearly conveyed. Now, at that point, it seems you do drive change from the top. You know, what did we just learn in this administration? You know, the vice president's office has a tremendous capacity to drive change, and the bureaucracy doesn't stand in the way. You know, I was in the Reagan administration. The Reagan Revolution was on the same page, and they drove change. And, you know, the bureaucracy resisted a bit, but not that much. Now, here we have an interesting situation, which is the bureaucracy was the force that resisted some of the change. So the question is how to enlist those career people, the ones who have been frustrated, in the restoration of the reasons why they were proud to serve in the government in the first place. And I think that takes a fair amount of energy and effort. You know, it makes the transition, getting off on the right foot, doing it well, getting a number of clear priorities outlined, discipline from the president's office and through the White House and to the leading parts of the government. I think that's incredibly important. But then the second piece of this is the relationship with Congress. You know, Lyndon Johnson, with the Congress that existed in the 60s, really got a lot done. Now, it foundered internationally, but in terms of creating a domestic agenda, which is on what everybody believes, they would like to see things better. Remember, the thing that wins people elections is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, right? And, you know, Obama recently said, were you better off than you were 4 weeks ago? If the new administration can create a sense, first, that the sky is not falling, that we don't have anything to fear because we are the greatest, richest country in the world with a long history and extraordinary human capacities. But then to turn the things that have been used as engines of fear into engines of collaboration. I mentioned, Charlie was at an earlier presentation, you know, this fear of foreigners, which has been stoked over the last however many years, when in fact it's always been the engine of American growth, economic development, you know, idealism, love of human rights. So the question is, this went to my point, you know, where is the office of homeland integration, of, you know, bringing immigrants into our society? Where is the office of, you know, strategic visa granting so that high-tech skills people can be brought in? Now, I think at the end of the day, I served in the bureaucracy, and I was a political appointee. And you're absolutely right that political appointees can only get so far without the bureaucracy. But you know what? People in the bureaucracies are happy when a political appointee comes in and actually seems to speak the values that they went to the government to serve in the first place. And, you know, they stand up and cheer. And by the way, our allies also stand up and cheer. I said this earlier, but I'll say it again. When Obama went to Berlin and gave a speech, and however many hundreds of thousands of people got up and cheered, they weren't cheering because he was saying, I'm going to do exactly the same thing as been done for the last 7 years. They really did not go for that message. They want to see something different. And I think that, you know, all of this is pushing in favor of delivering on the message. If the message, you know, it may turn out that change was a message that helped win an election. But as we all know from working in government, it's a lot harder to bring about change than it is to talk about change. Nevertheless, it can be done if government and non-governmental organizations, state and local initiatives work together on a well-thought-out, coordinated, non-compartmentalized, coherent agenda.
Okay, in the back, and then we'll come up front.
Hi, I'm Ellen Dorsey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Wallace Global Fund. You know, the results of the public opinion study are just so heartening and so exciting to see. And if you couple that with the, you know, myriad of groups that have appeared just in the last 4 to 8 years, working alongside historic human rights organizations in this country, you have a great reason to be optimistic about the public's receptivity to human rights policy domestically and globally. However, I have a couple concerns, and they're obvious concerns. If we assume an Obama administration, and I know I don't want to jinx anything, but let's play that as a scenario. And many of the people in this room will go into that administration, leaders of the human rights movement domestically and that are working on human rights abroad will go into that administration. So leadership from the human rights movement will go into the government. It is inevitable that that government will be juggling competing interests and disproportionate and ongoing corporate influence. So you add those factors up, and you have to ask the question, are we going to be willing to hold that administration's feet to the fire, and do we have a sufficient constituency to hold that administration's feet to the fire? And you can look at the last 8 years and say, we didn't have a sufficient constituency to stop the United States from using torture, or for shutting down Guantanamo, or for treating the least in our society with the most blatant of human rights violations. So what do we do to make sure the constituency's there to hold the feet to the fire?
Alan, do you want to start on that?
A couple of thoughts. I mean, one is, I think we definitely have the constituency. I think there's a question about whether we have the infrastructure, right? The infrastructure that for communications and to amplify the voices, because progressives typically don't actually believe that the public's with them, even when the public is with them, right? That's one of the characteristics of being a progressive, especially progressive politician. Part of our job has to be to remind people, remind those in leadership of the support that they do have, and then to be better at building that constituency. And that requires an infrastructure, some of which exists and some of which we're going to have to be better about connecting. And that means connecting community organizing with legal advocacy, being better about not just traditional media and communications, but the new media vehicles that are available to us. It means taking research on problems and solutions and translating it into a language that ordinary people, much less policymakers and journalists, can understand. And I think all of those pieces exist. If we were to think about a pipeline, the pipes are there, but they're not always connected in the way that they need to be. And I think one of our biggest responsibilities, and as somebody who used to work at a large foundation, one of the responsibilities of philanthropy that's committed to social justice is going to be to support the connections, not just the pipes, but the connections.
Okay, Harold?
I would disagree with the notion that we don't have the constituency. We just haven't mobilized the constituency around the right set of issues. You know, that would be like Barack Obama saying, I don't have the constituency to be elected president because I'm a first-term senator from Illinois who, in my previous election, got clobbered by Bobby Rush, right? He could easily have said that. And, you know, if he believed that, you know, he would be doing something other than what he's going to be doing. And so what he did, it seemed to me, was to build a constituency and energizing a certain group of people. Now, that constituency is available for these issues. You know, look at all these young people under the age of 25, you know, the cell phone text message generation that have been out there now working these issues. You know, they now see these as their issues. And that, I think, is an incredibly important thing. Another point which I think is really key is, and this is what I learned in government, you know, not every person is the same. You have to have the key people in the key positions. And then you play the inside-outside game. They have to push. You have to they have to be pushed. If they need your help and you're from civil society, you have to give it to them because they are the best people in the government from your perspective. And Congress is a part of that picture as well. And, you know, the reason we haven't ratified most of these treaties is not because people favor discrimination against women or against children having rights. You know, it's because of individuals who are chairs of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and those people might not be chairs anymore. So there are a lot of bottlenecks that are going to be unplugged. So when the bottlenecks are unplugged, the key is getting the right people into those issues who can actually start the channels moving. Final point about human rights is just that, you know, a low tide strands all boats. When people are really hurting and rights are being violated, usually other things in the society are going really wrong. So one way to address the underlying concerns, therefore, addresses the rights. You know, I think every American now favors our economy to be stabilized. You know, they would like people to start getting loans. They would like people to feel certain basic elements of economic security. And once they start thinking that government is competent at that, working with civil society, they can start thinking it's competent at other things too. That's what we learned from the New Deal. So I believe that to say that there is no constituency is the conclusion as opposed to the outcome that you want to reach, which is building the constituency because the moment of opportunity is here in a way that it hasn't been for many years.
Can I just say very briefly also that you know, the transition isn't beginning next week. In some sense, the transition has been underway for several months now. And so over the summer, we did outreach to not only the people on the advisory group, but other people who aren't listed, both on the Hill and working with the campaigns, to begin to educate them and to alert them to the fact that there is a constituency out there for these issues and to get it on their radar screen. Also, I just wanted to mention that we're going to have a couple of strategy sessions after the election to really think hard about how to mobilize the constituency and how to support the transition team in getting some of these structures into place. And one I want to make sure is on everyone's radar screen is November 17th at Columbia Law School. I believe it's 1 p.m. Risa Kaufman's here in the audience who's helping to organize that. Will be a roundtable discussion to talk about human rights at home. The last thing, Harold's point about young people with new technology, I think that is an untapped constituency that people have registered for the first time to vote. This will be their first time voting in record numbers. We need to reach out to those people in our educational institutions through YouTube videos. I'm hoping Alan will pick this up through his communications operation. We need to find new and creative ways to reach out to young people who will be the constituency for a future human rights movement.
Okay, great. Up front here, let's.
Charge and freelance correspondent. I have a comment and question. My comment is this. For this all land to be a model of the human right in the world, I think we have to go through two processes. One is through education. And the theme of education is this. Human right is a basic of a real civil society. And second is, you have mentioned, but I just go more concrete, is three presidents. And every U.S. department action affect human rights. So I think that's good. My question is, first question is this. I look at this campaign group, exclusive minority. I would like to ask why. And also then that, are you going to active recruit the majority into your group? Because human right is not just for minority, also human right is for majority. And my second question is this. I always heard that the U.S. government and U.S. NGO, when they talk about human rights outside United States, it's just a political tool. Thank you.
Harold?
You know what? I think we're Americans. I'm an American. I'm an American. He's an American. She's an American. Isn't that what the message you're hearing, at least from one of the candidates? It's not, a red America and a blue America. It's America, the United States of America. We have a guy running for president his father was born in Kenya. He lived in Indonesia. His mother is from Kansas. His grandmother's from Hawaii. This is an inclusive vision of Americans. Because when I was a kid, I'll tell you, the dean of Yale Law School was not a guy who looked like me. So now that is, by the way, enough to send a message to a lot of people in the world that A, education is good. B, America is a land of opportunity. C, this guy clerked for the Supreme Court. That's a message that they will allow you into the inner ranks of the highest legal circles early in your life. And I think it's a very important message. So I think, it's time for us to fashion a different, it's not just rhetoric. It really is a different moment. We live in the 21st century. So let's not transport or bring back all of these concepts that have been so divisive. I believe that religious people love human rights. They really do. Now the question is how to tap into that. I'm not an enemy of those people, whether they're Roman Catholics or whether they're Muslims. So I think that needs to be part of the message.
Okay. Yes, sir, right here.
My question is for Mr.
Would you identify yourself?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm Mark Gruenberg from Press Associates Union News Service. My question is I have a number of them, but I'll stick with one for Mr. Jenkins, because you glided over probably what was your key point, which is that in your survey, human rights ranked very low in terms of priorities when you asked the voters. At least for us in the union movement, it ranks pretty doggone high, and we're 1/4 of the electorate. So my question is, how do you push it up? How do you make more people single-issue human rights voters so that the candidates from Barack Obama on down really pay attention?
Okay.
Alan? I think the power and the challenge that's reflected in this of human rights is that it's not a single issue, right? It cuts across issues. It's core to who we are as a people and what we believe in, but it relates to labor and workers' rights and immigrant rights and the rights not to be discriminated against, but also not to be tortured, and to freedom of speech. And so, I think there's a framing issue, right? Because when you ask what people do rank highly, I think many of us would see human rights embedded in that. When people say they care about health care and they care about education, quality schools for their kids, and they care about the United States' reputation in the world, and they care about their physical safety, freedom from attack, all of those relate to human rights. But because we haven't invested, this goes to the gentleman's education point, because we haven't invested in educating Americans about what human rights mean and what they could mean, human rights are not top of mind for people. You could tell when we had the conversation in these focus groups, you could see light bulbs coming on of folks realizing, well, first of all, that they had never been asked to talk about human rights and what they believe. And second, how fulsome and empowering a notion it is. I'll give you a quick anecdote and then I'll stop. One of the focus groups, it was African-American women, and we gave them a brief summary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and what it includes. And we passed it around and they started reading it, and you could see them, the group, this was all African-American women, start to get excited about it and empowered, and they were talking about it and all this, and then things took a turn. And one woman said, well, you know what, if this has been around since 1948, why do we have to go through all the crap we went through? Right? And then the things went downhill from there, right? Now, none of us, I was on the other side of the glass. Nobody pointed out that the Constitution was around for 150 years before it meant anything in the lives of many, many Americans. But there was literally no knowledge. And so people were able to have, it was like the stages of death, right? Denial and, bargaining and the like. That's part of our responsibility, but it's also part of the responsibility of a new leadership. If you're going to say that health care is a human right, you need to talk about what that means and what it connects to, and why many of the things that Americans do rank very highly and urgently are part of our fundamental system of human rights.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Let's go to the back. Yes. Wait, just a second, Tanya. Take the mic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Koch from the U.S. Human Rights Fund, and I'm representing the wing of philanthropy. And I want to tell Alan that we have that well in hand, that whole integration of grassroots organizing and policy and legal work. But I wanted to ask a question about what needs to be done with regard to educating incoming administration officials. And here I don't just mean the leadership. I mean, Harold, you were sort of suggesting that we get the right people in there and the change will flow from the top. But I mean, I would assume when I read Alan's statistics about 8% of the American public having any idea what international human rights or universal human rights standards are anyway, that I would venture that the degree of knowledge about those standards among, the class, right, of folk who are going to be going into the administration in deputy positions or assistant positions or even line positions is not going to be all that much better. Does there need to be some program of education of, administration people or members of Congress about what we're really talking about? Or, should we assume we do the values talk and with the right leadership, it will happen?
Okay, thank you. Harold?
Well, a couple things. First of all, if there are people, political appointees who are relevant to what you care about, you should meet them before you're pounding their tail to get something. In other words, to just have a relationship. Secondly, you have the benefit, which they don't have, of institutional knowledge. One question is always, well, what went wrong in the past? Where were the bottlenecks? Where did something get hung up? Was there someone in my position who could have done something different but didn't do it? And why didn't they not do it? Now, later on, when you come back and ask them for something specific, they're going to always ask one question. I say this to the students. Why me? Why now? Why this? And if you're not giving an answer to that question, they're not going to do it. Why me? Why now? Why this? Why are you coming to me? Why is now the time I have to do something? And why do I have to do the thing you're suggesting as opposed to something else? Now, I think the NGOs who are clever, smart, able, people who've served in the government or close to the government, do it right. They meet the officials early. They develop a relationship. They indicate how they can help. They educate them about things that have been wrong in the past. They show a basic support. And then later, when you come back to collaborate on particular issues, they have a reason they came to you rather than just to scream about something. And there's something specific they want you to do that you are very well positioned to do. And that's extremely helpful. So I would say I dealt with many NGOs in my prior position. Some of them were much, 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 much more helpful than others.
Anything last comments from either of you?
Yeah, I was just going to say on training that most of the agencies and departments do have training arms, and I think human rights education should be built into that. Also, the Federal Judicial Center does training for judges. The Aspen Institute and a number of non-governmental organizations do training at the state and local level. I think there's a role for a new Human Rights Commission to play in training. I think we need to have human rights education throughout public schools across the country. We can build that into the curriculum. I think it's going to be very important for a new president to take leadership on making sure that human rights is part of the training that his incoming administration gets.
Yeah, I would just emphasize the point about models existing. The Aspen Institute program is for judges is the one I'm most familiar with, and I know Harold has played a part in. It's a remarkable program that has trained now dozens and dozens of federal and I think some state judges on what international human rights law and humanitarian law means for them and what their responsibilities are, but also how it can be integrated into the fabric of American law in a way that's fully consistent with the framers' intent and with kind of evolving jurisprudence. And I think that model is one that can really be expanded, and also that we have seen in the last few years many of the fruits of it in jurisprudence that pays respect to human rights standards, that uses them to inform domestic jurisprudence, even as it acknowledges that many treaties have not been signed and ratified or have reservations or are not self-executing. So I think we need to go to those models and really expand on them.
Okay, great. Great discussion. Thank you for coming and joining me in thanking the panel.